Mom is a very, very important influence in a man's life, as we're going to find out in this session. I want to make one qualification here as I start. So every guy look at me just for a moment. I'm not picking on your mother. Okay? What I'm going to be doing here this morning is we're going to be exploring the influence of a mom on a man's life and how sometimes unknowingly that influence, which she meant for good, can end up as a wound in a man's life. In their book, The Mom Factor, Doctors Henry Cloud and John Townsend write these words. They say, other than Dad, no one has influenced more the person you are today than your mother. The way she has handled your needs as a child has shaped your worldview, your relationships, your marriage, your career, your self-image, your life. What we learn in our relationship with our mother deeply affects every area of our adult life now. And we know that to be true. Mom goes deep in the male psyche. You know, a lot of times they have recorded airline pilots right as they're going down to crash, you know, in those little black box. Recently, as they were replaying one of those little black boxes, as the pilot was trying to get control of the aircraft, right before it hit the ground, the last words were, "Mom." It's kind of like it went all the way down to the primal beginning of life. And there at the very core stands Mom. She's a powerful influence over a man's life. Unfortunately, sometimes that influence that mother has in your life leaves a wound. Kevin is but one illustration of this. And let me just read you an illustration of the life of Kevin. Kevin loved his wife. He adored her, but he was not strong enough in his own right to say no to her. The chief area that he experienced this was in his own need for time with a hobby or with friends. When he wanted space in which to pursue a hobby or to be with friends, she wanted him home. And he could not stand up for his own separateness. He would comply and then resent her, and then his love feelings would begin to disappear for her. This pattern continued until finally his resentment built up to the point that he actually left her. He complained that he felt smothered and controlled. What he could not see was that this was his own fault. Kevin had never established boundaries with his own mom. A strong-willed woman, she was content to be in control of him, and he had never left her. So instead of leaving Mom and cleaving to his wife, he turned his wife into Mom and left her instead. This is one of the most common divorce scenarios that occur in men's lives. Men see the controlling woman as the problem, and they fail to deal with their own flimsy boundaries. If they had established good boundaries with their mothers, they would not fear being controlled by their wives or their girlfriends. "Stop controlling me!" would turn into, "No, I don't want to." Men often see their wives and girlfriends as the controlling mothers that they're not strong enough to deal with, and so they leave. Now, I tell you the story of Kevin because I want you to see a point here, one that you're going to recognize real quickly, and that's just this. Much of what Kevin was dealing with in his marriage, remember this, was simply this: unfinished business. He's still walking around with Mom's apron strings. He didn't know it. He never analyzed it. He never did what we talked about several weeks ago, and that is looking back to find out why I am the way I am. He deals ignorantly in the now, fighting phantoms that he can't see, and thinking this person's the problem when the roots go way back to that suitcase that he carries and the apron that's within it. This is what we call the mom factor. And it's prevalent in a lot of men's lives, believe it or not. A healthy relationship with mom requires two significant breaks, guys. The first is from physical bondedness. Most of you know about that one. At physical birth requires this newborn who's been part of the mother's body for 9 months. Like you, when at one point you were literally one with your mother for those 9 months. Suddenly there comes a moment where you have to be separate from her. But to be separate from her requires an unnatural break, one that she can't necessarily do for herself. And at birth, there has to be this cutting of the umbilical cord. Now, I happen to be at the birth of all 4 of my children. And I can still see, as sometimes the kids like to replay their birth moment, where I'm in there with the camera moving around, and I helping coach my wife to breathe and all the things that I learned in those classes. And I can still see in the birth of my last son, the camera's going, and Dr. Quay pulls my son out of the womb and holds it up, and he's from Taiwan. He says, "Dad, it's a boy. Come, cut cord." And you see the camera, and then you see these scissors come out in the camera, and there's the umbilical cord, and I start cutting that cord in two. And suddenly, a transformation takes place. And that is that my son goes from being one with his mom to separate from his mom. Now, for us, not having experienced that personally, that seems like a rather routine thing that occurs just in birth. But did you know that for many moms, that is deeply significant, that moment? Because in that cut, the uncomfortable, that comfortable relationship that mom had with her child, that she had grown accustomed to, that was easy for her now, that she had experienced over those months, suddenly that radically changes. And she can no longer relate to the child the way she once did. That relationship has literally been cut off. And a change has occurred. And for some women, that change is so difficult emotionally that she suffers from what is called postpartum blues. Have you heard that? If you've heard that, raise your hand just for a moment. Let me just say, everybody's heard of postpartum blues. Sometimes it becomes postpartum depression because it's so difficult to deal with. Literally, after the parting blues, because the relationship has changed. Now, most every woman eventually gets over that in this transition from oneness to separateness. But there's a second separation that a lot of moms don't make and never get over or have difficulty handling. It is a separation that's far more important than cutting this physical umbilical cord. It occurs when a son is seeking to go from being a mama's boy to being a man in his own right. And in that moment, another kind of cut is desperately needed. That cut is the cut from emotional bondedness. And it's extremely important. But for a mom to willingly give up or lose her emotional hold over your life and my life, that is a very traumatic thing that far exceeds the physical separateness. A lot of cultures recognize that. It's interesting that many primitive cultures recognize the need for that emotional cut. Not long ago, I was reading a story of a primitive tribe, and they have a very elaborate ceremony to bring that about. When the child is just about at puberty, the son is just about at puberty, the tribe arranges for this traumatic moment. The women in the tribe are given kind of a heads up on it, but late in the night, the men in the tribe dress up as warriors, and they come beating drums with lighted torches and yelling and screaming, and they rush into the mother's house or the mother's hut and grab the child, the son. And the mother, knowing all this is going to happen, still plays into it, and she's screaming, my boy, and he's screaming, mama, mama, mama. And the warriors pull the son from the mother's arms. And as he cries and reaches out for mom, they, with drums beating, carry the son out into a new life. And from that day forward, he lives with the men, never to live with mama again. And in that traumatic cut, he understands, as painful as it is, that he's no longer to relate to mama. He's to relate to the community of men. He's crossed over. Now, in that, it requires that mama wants to let him go, right? And I'm sure if we went into that tribe, there are a lot of mothers that would rather keep their sons right there in the hut with them for the rest of their life. Now, here's the question I want to ask you. Where in America, in the good old U.S. of A., do we have a clear place for such an emotional separation between mother and son? And the answer is, we don't, do we? There's no clear place along the road of life. And that is why, gentlemen, many men are still emotionally bonded with mom in one way or another. Now, we're going to explore some of the different ways. Some of them are very deeply entrenched. Some of them are just lightly connected. But because there's no clear separation, a lot of guys in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s still have this connection to both worlds. And that's why it's difficult for them to fully and separately identify into the world of men and to express manhood at a deeply emotional level, because there's still ties back to mom. Here's how Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend summarize all this. They say, to understand what is going on with men in their relational world, we must first look at some developmental patterns in their childhood. In the beginning, the young male is connected to mom. If things go well, with the attaching mom, he learns to feel comfortable with his dependency on her. Bonding, needing, and connecting are comfortable for him, and he enjoys being close. He's one with mom. But then he begins to separate from her in the second and third year of life and moves out of oneness into a separate identity. It's important that he not only become a separate person, but that he becomes secure in his gender identity. Later, as he moves away from mom and towards dad for identification with male identity, he accomplishes two things. One, he becomes a separate person, attaching to his father and gaining more autonomy from the oneness with mom. And secondly, in his attachment to his father and identification with him as a male, he gains gender identity. From this strong base, he becomes someone who is comfortable with connection and dependence on someone, but separate enough to be autonomous and an individual away from his object of dependency. He also becomes secure in his male identity. In short, he can love mom and be independent from her all at the same time. And then later he finds a woman to whom he can have a significant attachment, and he marries. And with all of this secure identity, he is strong and separate with his new love when it comes to boundaries and limits, and he stays free of her control, and yet he's comfortable with both his and her perfections, and now sees her as a person he can relate intimately with. And in this way, he's come full circle. He has successfully returned to the woman, but as an individual in his own right. So, real health for a man goes this way. Let me just give it to you in this little diagram. You can fill it in. From oneness with mom literally, to a healthy physical separation, to a healthy emotional separation, to finally a healthy oneness with a woman relationally, called his wife. Did you know the book of Genesis pictures this really well? Just in one phrase in Genesis chapter 2. Here's the way it says it. For this cause, not speaking of marriage, of ultimately moving into an intimate relationship with a woman, for this cause a man shall leave, and by the way, the word in Hebrew there, leave, is to cut. It's speaking of this cutting, just like cutting an umbilical cord. Shall leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave in a healthy way to his wife, and they are able to become one flesh. And the reason they're able to become one flesh is because his ties are not back to his family, and in particular, as we're talking about this morning, he's still not connected with his mom. That's how he can relate successfully to his wife. Now that's the way it should be, but often it's not, because often mom, for one reason or another, in one way or another, refuses to let go, and that creates what I call the mother wound. Let me give you a definition for the mother wound. Here's what it is. It's an unhealthy emotional relationship with mother that causes a son to either be threatened by the influence of women later on in his life, or to over-identify and become submissive to that influence. Now, when I first taught this material years ago, I added this mother wound almost as an afterthought. I added it because I'd had some of that in my own life with my mom, filling in for my dad. But I had no idea how pervasive it was in men's lives across our community until I began to teach it and then get the response that I did. And as other pastors in other cities and other locations have taught this same experience, they've said, you know, this is really an issue with men. So if you're out there as a man here this morning and you're feeling, even now as I talk about some of these things, you're feeling, boy, there is something there for me. But there's probably something wrong with me. Most guys aren't attached to their moms, are they? Let me tell you, a lot of guys in some funny ways are. So don't feel alone. Remember what we learned about men's fraternity? This is a safe place and you're not alone. A lot of people in this room that can identify with what you're feeling maybe even now. It's an unhealthy emotional bondedness in some ways that later on in adult life cause you to have different responses to women and how you relate to a woman. And by the way, how you're relating right now to your girlfriend or your wife has attachments back at home. And if they're unhealthy attachments, it's called the mother wound. Now, here's some important characteristics about this wound. First, this wound is not blatant. This wound is subtle. When we've been talking about the father wound, we're talking about a nasty gash that guys feel. It's a ragged cut that bleeds and you can see it. And guys know they have it. But a mother wound is like a paper cut. You've had a paper cut where you've done it and stung and you look down and you can't see anything. It's almost invisible. But the point is, whether it's a nasty gash or it's a paper cut, eventually both of them bleed, don't they? They both bleed. That's the mother wound. Secondly, this wound is not one of abuse. The mother wound is not one of abuse. It's not mom being bad. It's not one of neglect or even absenteeism. It's a wound disguised as love and care. And that's part of the reason this wound is so hard to deal with, because it looks so nurturing and caring and loving. It's the Trojan horse. Some of you guys, if you remember your Greek mythology, you remember the Greeks trying to conquer the city of Troy. And they couldn't get in because the walls were so high. So what they did is they built this giant wooden horse and they gave it to the Trojans as a gift. At least the Trojans thought it was a gift. Inside were enemy soldiers. And they set the horse outside the gates and they opened the gates and brought the horse in thinking, gosh, look at this wonderful gift. And then they went to sleep and then the top of the horse opened and the enemy soldiers got out and the Greeks conquered the city. That's the way the mother wound works. You invite it in because it comes in as a gift. But inside, once it opens, are things of hurt. They weren't intended to. That's how it actually impacts a man's life. Thirdly, this is not a wound of inattention like it is with the absent father wound. This is a wound of over-attention. It's over-involvement and over-identification with. It's over-concern, which keeps the relationship between a son and a mother over time fused and connected in inappropriate ways. Fourth, this is a wound that looks like love, but over time it feels like control. It looks like love, but it feels like control. This is also wound number 5 that's so powerful that in adulthood it can wrongly shape or warp the masculine psyche. Guys, I've talked to men over the last 15 years, and I know of men who are still tethered to mom's wishes, to mom's feelings about him and his marriage and his children and what he does. Still tethered in some emotional way to mom's control over him, even though they're 40 years old or 50 years old or even 60 years old. Now, sometimes we can just sit back and kind of laugh about it, like this cartoon here that I want to put up. Take a look at the cartoon for a moment. This guy's at a psychiatrist, and it says at the bottom, "Next session, Mrs. Bentlow, I'd like your son to solo." And there he is. He knows he's got problems. He's come to see the psychiatrist, but mom's going to be right there with him, still taking care of him. You know, when I was about 16, I began to feel that love that felt like control. As my dad had problems, as I've talked to you about, and mom filled that vacuum, as mothers often responsibly have to do. After a while, though, as they had their war with each other over the different issues in their life, we were called in by mom. As she loved us and dad was absent, she expected in that love for us to be loyal. And my 2 brothers obediently followed whatever criticisms or thoughts she had about my dad. I was the only one that could look at it for whatever reason. Maybe it's just personality. And I thought, you know, there's certain things that we could do here that could help both of you, but you're going to have to both give a little. I kind of, as I said, got called in to be the negotiator. But let me tell you, when your mom is giving you a lot of love and expects loyalty, you don't negotiate. You just obey. And every time I didn't obey, I paid a huge price. I was alienated, criticized. I was called every name in the book. And all I wanted to see as a little 16-year-old was just my mom and dad love each other. But see, it wasn't about love. It felt like love. It presented as love. But it demanded control. And that's what happens in a lot of guys' lives because they love their moms. We all love our moms. But oftentimes that love can turn sour if we're not careful. Now, let's just ask the question, how does this wound occur? Well, I want to give you just kind of 2 general reasons I think will be obvious to everybody in light of what we've been talking about. First, it often begins with an absent or distant father. Doesn't mean that dad's not in the home. He may be in the home, but he's just not involved in the home. And so mom tends to move in and fill the void in some ways. And there are kids that are going to be going to school here in the next few moments all over the city of Little Rock who mom is filling the void. Dad's making the money, but mom's filling the void because dad's absent one way or another. And I told you that in the last 50 to 100 years, our modern society has given young men more and more over to the world of women. They grow up in homes where mom is the primary presence because dad's not there. They go to schools where the school teachers are primarily women. They go to churches where in their grade school classes, they primarily have female mentors. And so their whole world becomes a world of women, and they have to figure out masculinity in absentia, without men. And now, interestingly, there's a new phenomenon in the last 20 years where more and more sons are finishing college and stuff like that and coming back home to live with mom and dad. And dad's thinking they need to get out on their own. But mom's welcoming them back. Come on, live with us, son. I'll wash your clothes. I'll continue to feed you. I'll take care of you. I want to continue to be your mom. Because there's no cut. There's no break. That's so unhealthy. Sociologist Marion Levy has written that the overabundance of female mentors, I'm quoting him now, with little interaction with male mentors, here's what he says, is a historical peculiarity unlike anything we've ever seen. And the product we are reaping is what he calls the feminized man. Now, I want you to look at that term just for a moment. The feminized man. What is that? Don't confuse it, guys, with the effeminate man. The man who has feminine physical characteristics or mannerisms. That's not what we're talking about. The feminized man can be the toughest, roughest guy you ever want to be around on the outside. But he can still be feminized. A feminized man is a man who has learned to act or think in ways that are more appropriate for women. He's passive oftentimes. He waits. He doesn't initiate. He doesn't lead. He follows. He doesn't take risk. He lets somebody else assert themselves in the moment. But he's strong and tough looking. But he defers. And he defers in this generation with a lot of young men to women. Let them be the warrior, the risk taker, the leader. The roles are reversed. And our culture is pumping out dogma that reverses the roles while it claims to be making them equal. And with young men being in the world of women and hearing all of that, suddenly their world is turned upside down. And if there's not a dad there to help correct that, which oftentimes there's not, since 40% of young people growing up in America today are without fathers, it creates tremendous emotional confusion and it keeps sons connected to mom. So it begins often with an absent dad. A second cause, though, more general, it's inflicted by 4 types of moms. One of 4 types of moms. And this can be dad in the home and involved in the home, but it can still be inflicted by one of 4 types of moms. The most common is what I'm just going to call the ignorant mom. The ignorant mom. Now, when I say ignorant, not ignorant in her intelligence. She can be brilliant. But ignorant in the sense that she doesn't understand the power she has over a son's life. And so today, with the idea of manhood being so vague and with a little by dad to help a boy know how he joins the community of men, she by default, continues to interact with her son in ways